It's no secret that the Industrial Revolution was a dark time for many people, but did you know there was a group of children who were covered in soot from head to toe? These children would wake up every morning before sunrise and immediately start sweeping chimneys. They would work all day long, often without food or water, until the sun went down. Then they would go home and try to clean themselves up so they could go to bed. But it was nearly impossible to get rid of the soot that had been covering their bodies all day. It seemed like no matter how much they scrubbed, the soot would just keep coming off on them. And because they were so tired from working all day, they would fall asleep only to have nightmares about being covered in soot. When they woke up in the morning, they would feel just as dirty as they did the night before, and the cycle would start all over again. Hi, I'm your host, and you're listening to this channel. Tonight, we'll be taking a look at some scary Victorian chimney sweeps stories. If that sounds good to you, then be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. In the 1800s, industrialization brought about many changes to the world as we know it today. With factories pumping out goods like never before, cities became overcrowded and unsanitary. This led to a surge in poverty and child labor. Children were seen as a cheap and expendable source of labor and were often employed in dangerous and unhealthy working conditions. One of the most hazardous jobs a child could be assigned to was that of the chimney sweep. Chimney sweeps were responsible for cleaning the chimneys of wealthy homes and businesses, a job that required them to crawl through narrow and often blocked flues. Without any safety equipment, these young workers would scrape soot and debris from the inside of the chimneys by hand, exposing them to high levels of toxic gases and particles. If that wasn't bad enough, they also risked serious injury from falls or being trapped in the chimneys. The average age of a chimney sweep was around 10 years old. Many were younger, some as young as 4 or 5. The youngest sweeps were known as the rat tribe. They were small enough to fit in the narrowest flues, and because of their size, they could do more work in less time. They were considered a valuable asset to the sweepmaster, the man who hired them out to clean chimneys. A typical workday for a chimney sweep began before sunrise and lasted well into the evening. In the morning, the sweeps would gather at the sweepmaster's house and receive their assignments for the day, after which they'd set off in a group, each carrying a small brush, a scraper, and a bag made of flax or hemp for collecting soot. As the morning wore on, the children would make their way from house to house, climbing up the walls and crawling through the chimneys. Once inside the flue, the sweeps would use the brushes and scrapers to remove the buildup of soot and debris. They would then collect the debris in their bags, securing it with a rope so it wouldn't fall apart. After finishing a chimney, the sweep would climb down, empty his bag, and move on to the next house. For the sweeps, their working conditions were incredibly harsh. Not only did they have to deal with the physical demands of the job, such as climbing and crawling, but they were also exposed to high levels of pollution and toxins. The soot and debris they removed from the chimneys contained a variety of harmful substances, including asbestos, which is known to cause lung cancer. In addition, the sweeps were not provided with any safety equipment and were expected to work without any regard for their own safety. They often had to crawl through narrow and confined spaces, putting them at risk of serious injury from falls or being trapped. Despite the danger, the sweeps were paid very little for their work and were often forced to work long hours for very little money. Many of them came from poor families and had no other means of income. They were desperate for work and were willing to put themselves in harm's way in order to make a few pennies. The dangers of the job were not lost on those who lived during the time. Many people, including doctors, social reformers, and even the Queen, were aware of the terrible working conditions for chimney sweeps and the risks they faced every day. But despite the outcry, little was done to protect these young workers. The government was concerned with the economy, and the business owners were unwilling to change their ways. The sweeps was seen as a necessary evil, a cheap and expendable source of labor that could be easily replaced. As the Industrial Revolution continued to grow and the demand for goods increased, the working conditions for chimney sweeps became even more dire. The children were subjected to ever more dangerous conditions and were forced to work longer and longer hours for less and less pay. It was unang until the 20th century that laws were finally passed to protect the rights of chimney sweeps and ensure their safety. Now that you know how dangerous it was for chimney sweeps to do their job, I think it's time we hear some stories of chimney sweeps who did unmake it home after a hard day's work. In 1840, London was a city choked by smoke. The air was thick with soot and ash from the countless factories and businesses that lined its streets. For many of the city's residents, life was a constant struggle to breathe. And for the poorest of the poor, it was a fight for survival. Among the most vulnerable were the children who worked as chimney sweeps, scraping the insides of chimneys by hand. Their job was dangerous, dirty, and often deadly. One such victim was a young boy named Robert, who died after becoming stuck in a chimney. He had been working for a local sweep master, a cruel and uncaring man who had little regard for the safety of his young workers. On the day of the accident, Robert had been sent to clean the chimney of a large house belonging to one of London's wealthiest families. The job was a particularly dangerous one, as the chimney was narrow and the flues were blocked with soot. But Robert was only 10 years old, and he had been working as a sweep for several years. He was small enough to fit in the tightest spaces, and his employer knew that he was the perfect boy for the job. Robert climbed into the chimney and began to scrape away the soot. But soon, he realized that he was in trouble. The chimney was too narrow for him to turn around, and he was trapped. He called out for help, but his cries were ignored. The soot was thick and suffocating, and Robert began to panic. He tried to claw his way out of the chimney, but it was no use. He was stuck fast, and the air was growing thin. As the minutes turned into hours, Robert's strength began to fail him. He could hear the family he was working for enjoying their dinner as he slowly suffocated inside their chimney. Finally, he slumped to the floor, his body lifeless. When his fellow sweeps arrived at the scene, they found Robert's body lodged in the chimney. It was clear that he had died of suffocation, his face contorted in a silent scream. The sweeps tried their best to pull Robert's body out of the chimney, but it was too big to come out whole. They were forced to cut it up piece by piece and lower it to the ground. Robert's death was a tragedy, but it was not an isolated one. Hundreds of other sweep children died in the same way across London that year. The authorities did little to investigate these deaths, and the sweep masters continued to hire young children to clean the city's chimneys. So, if you enjoyed this episode and would like to listen to more stories like this, then stay tuned for our next episode